Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Bright Blue TV titled The Future of Conservatism. My name is Ioana Diac. I am a researcher at Bright Blue, and I will be your host for today. Joining me to discuss what strand of conservatism the new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak should pursue is our fantastic panel made up of Tryl, the UK Director of the Research, Strategy and Communications Consultancy More in Common, Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of the ConservativeHome news site, and Alys Denby, Deputy Editor of Opinion and news site CapX. For those of you watching at home, you can submit questions for our panel via Slido by using the link in the description box below. And you can also tweet about the event using the hashtag BBTV. Now, on to the topic at hand. For hundreds of years, the Conservative Party has been a successful but sometimes uneasy coalition of different strands of conservatism, such as One Nation Toryism, libertarianism, Thatcherism, and even communitarianism. Since David Cameron's premiership ended in 2016, we've had 4 different prime ministers in Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and now Rishi Sunak, with each of them bringing their own brand of conservatism. As Rishi Sunak enters Downing Street to become our 5th Prime Minister in just 6 years, we will be discussing what strand of conservative thought is best equipped to tackle the economic uncertainties we face and deliver another electoral victory for the Conservative Party in 2024. So I want to start with you, Henry. As Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome, you offer a platform for all strands of conservative ideology. Which strands do you think are particularly prominent at the moment, and which one of those strands do you think Rishi Sunak most closely aligns himself with?
I think it's very hard to say what Rishi Sunak stands for. The manifesto he stood on in the first leadership contest in the summer was a complete sort of grab bag of things from different parts of the party's ideological landscape, and then he's jettisoned nearly all of it to focus on the budget and what will probably be a very painful course of austerity. So he's sort of a right Cameroon, I suppose, would be roughly where I'd put Rishi Sunak, but I don't think that's a particularly precise ideological label. And I think the Conservative Party has a broader problem, which is that it's currently stuck partway through a transition between 2 relatively coherent visions for what the Conservative Party is. You've got the sort of traditional post-Thatcher one, very southern focused on middle class voters, better off voters. And then you've got the red wall one, which Boris Johnson sort of set off in the direction of, if he didn't quite reach it, which is more comfortable with public spending, more focused on the north of England, more focused on lower income voters, more nationalistic, and less free market. Now, either of those is potentially a coherent ideological offer. There is a voter coalition that can elect that party, and that party can then have a relatively coherent program of government. Unfortunately, what we've got at the moment is we've got a Conservative Party which is being pulled in all kinds of different directions, appears to be incapable of making any sort of hard choices about which bits of its current quite unstable coalition it's prepared to aggravate, and so as a result is sort of losing in every direction.
Turning to you, Alys, are you worried that Liz Truss has hurt libertarian conservatism and in turn left Sunak with little political room to make his own stamp on what conservatism should look like?
Yeah, I think it's very regrettable that the kind of ideas that we like to promote on CapX about shrinking the state, about the power of free markets to spread freedom and prosperity have been essentially buried by Liz Truss's poor judgment in the mini budget. I think that's really regrettable because I think her essential analysis was correct. We do need to get this country back to growth. We've been too sclerotic. I don't think we should just accept that the kind of highest burden since the days of state socialism under Attlee is just an inevitable consequence of population change. I don't think we should accept that young people have to work ever longer hours for ever less pay to support the sort of creaking health and social care system. And I think it's really regrettable that those values have now become slightly toxic because of how poorly she presented them.
Yeah. Now, turning to you, Luke, one of the things that Sunak promised in his first speech as Prime Minister was to bring the same compassion he displayed during the COVID crisis to the economic challenges we face today. So do you think it is good for the Conservative brand to have someone who embodies more compassionate conservatism, especially during a cost of living crisis? And has Sunak gone far enough with this, or is there more that he could do?
Well, I think it's definitely a good thing. And actually, you know, the Conservative Party throughout its history in all its different incarnations has had a placed a premium on, you know, protecting the most vulnerable in society, demonstrating its compassionate edge. And I think the fact that Sunak went out of his way to reiterate that actually is really important for the future of the party, because we know that the Conservatives lose when they start to become seen as totally heartless and divorced from what most people are thinking. I think the challenge that Sunak faces, and, you know, fairly or unfairly, is that he doesn't quite yet pass with lots of voters that he's on my side test. And part of that is the mess which was made over the sort of 6 weeks of the Truss premiership, which has damaged the entire party brand. But part of it comes down to, unfortunately, his personal wealth and how people perceive that. And that, you know, is a barrier he'll have to overcome. And some of it comes from the cost of living crisis, this sense that actually at every stage, when we talk to voters in focus groups, this will say, but why did they have to be dragged in to giving us this help? Why didn't they do anything proactively as well? So I think those three challenges are what he'll have to overcome to actually sort of put the proof in the pudding of being a compassionate Conservative. Because the other thing that's interesting, and just to go to Henry's point, is that when we've been doing polling and focus groups with those two wings of the Tory party, which, you know, Henry's entirely right, they often look in opposite directions, is that amongst that kind of blue wall group, that traditional group, what we're finding is actually Sunak's got Tory support almost back to where it was at the last election. They like him, they think he's competent. It's with that red wall group where he's slightly struggling still. And I think it's part of it from talking to people, is he on my side? Is he going to get us through the cost of living? Does he understand the struggles which people are facing? And I think that's the real challenge there.
I wonder if there's an extent to which kind of economic reality might in some ways help the Conservatives, because frankly, at the next election, Labour are going to have to set out their vision for how they're going to deal with the public finances. And it's very difficult to see how they are going to do that in a way that seems that just has a more kind of compassionate feel, because, you know, I feel like cuts are going to have to be inevitable at some point. So weirdly, the kind of compassion point might give way to the economic competence point, perhaps.
Yeah. And it is definitely true that on that, Sunak actually scores a home run. And I think, you know, weirdly, and others have said this isn't original, he actually in some ways benefits from what happened under Liz Truss, because people think, well, yeah, actually, he was kind of right about what would happen. Whether that is true or not, he's definitely getting some credit for having made a different set of arguments over the summer.
And talking about the economy, sorry, Henry, you go.
I just say I think the other thing that the government's going to have to do at some point is actually start making, because the economic reality is that they're going to have to keep cutting and, you know, raising taxes when the tax burden is already so high, is that they're going to have to do what David Cameron and George Osborne refused to do or declined to do, which is actually start making strategic decisions about if we're going to maintain public spending on things like the NHS, which just needs more and more money, we actually need to stop the state doing other stuff and make positive decisions about that. Because I was having this discussion with somebody the other day, other than Sure Start centres and, you know, a couple of sort of fringe policies like EMA, it's actually quite hard to think of things that, even through all that austerity we had since the coalition was elected in 2010, it's actually hard to think of things that the government actually stopped doing, like enumerated things that it just decided not to fund anymore. At a time when, you know, you can't go a day without reading about some or other aspect of the NHS crisis, there is a courts backlog that is years long and is preventing people getting justice. There is clearly going to be a need, not just for more cuts, but for the government to actually, unless it just wants all public services to keep getting unsustainably worse, it's going to have to make some quite hard decisions, which the Conservatives have not done so far, about what the actual scope of the state is relative to the amount of money we have available.
I think there's potential to make that into a positive. I mean, I feel like Kemi Badenoch's campaign did try to talk about that sort of stuff, about a state that could do fewer things better. And I feel like this could potentially be quite appealing to some people. The idea of reducing the number of sort of diversity jobs in the NHS and refocusing on core services might prove quite a compelling message.
But if you do that, to do that, you would have to actually change the legislation underpinning. This is something that, again, that's for the Conservatives very bad at, is they complain a lot about the symptoms of various things they dislike. They'll complain about quangos, they'll complain about diversity and inclusion officers and all the rest of it, but they're in power with a majority. And so the question always, and this is why I think they're struggling with red wall voters, is red wall voters are being like, well, why haven't you amended the Equality Act? Why haven't you done, all this thing? They keep complaining about things when they're in power. It's an oppositional approach, which ultimately voters can see through, because the argument is always, well, you're in a position to do something about it. So yes, in theory, the government could maybe turn this into at least a red wall facing positive message, but they'd need to actually marry that up to legislative action. And so far, we've seen precious little evidence that the government's actually prepared to do that.
But on that, I mean, you've alluded to the danger of it. We know, as you said, you can find 40 MPs, Tory MPs, basically to vote against anything at the moment. And I just think the horror show of opening up the Equality Act with all of the different various interests, I think it would be an act. I'm sorry, and there is clearly, there is clearly appetite in the red wall, and actually beyond the red wall, for reducing some of the sort of bureaucracy and cutting down on some of these sort of DEI roles that people think is very tick boxy and doesn't actually do anything. The appetite's there, but coming to that legislation, I think it would take up so much parliamentary time. You'd have absolutely everything, right from debates about kind of gender thrown in to what responsibility public services have, and actually with 2 years left to the next general election, is that really where we want to be?
I mean, opening up the legislation is definitely a first-term government thing that this government can't do. But there are, if you wanted some quick wins, the government. So there was a row the other month about RAF recruitment, for example. Apparently there's been a freeze on RAF recruitment. The Secretary of State can, by regulation, simply delist the RAF from being subject to the public sector equality duty. Now, whether or not that's a good idea is a separate discussion, but it's not necessarily the same process as actually legislating to reform the Act. There are provisions in the Act for ministers to act by regulation, and they could use that to get some quick wins if they wanted to. And if they don't, then really they need to stop complaining about RAF recruitment, because if they're keeping that framework in place, then that's on them.
I think the reality isn't it, at the moment, that doing any of these things is basically impossible while the party is kind of collapsing in on itself among personal dramas and petty grievances. The problem that Rishi Sunak has is one of party governance at the moment. He doesn't have time to be thinking about what true Conservative values are. He just needs to get through the next week without losing another cabinet minister.
Yeah, that is true.
I think that's what he needs to. I think the danger for that, though, is that you then, again, you get to 2024 and you're like, okay, you've been a great manager, but, there's clearly some desire for a fresh start. So I just wonder, are they starting to think, yes, we need to get to Christmas, but what are going to be the 2 or 3 totemic things? What are going to be the sort of, if I can call it this sort of Michael Gove-esque things that we're going to be able to go into the next election and say we did this, this and this? Because, for all of the flaws of previous Tory governments, the Cameron government, you at least came out of it saying, actually, education, universal credit, gay marriage, ODA, you might not agree with them, but there were substantive set of achievements there. Similarly, even with the May government, aside from the Brexit stuff, you had the mental health focus. I just wonder what, after 2 years, they're going to come out and say, other than, oh, well, we got us out of the mess, which we know voters won't reward.
Well, currently they're talking about, trying to do the British Bill of Rights, which has been, as I wrote this morning, going to be an absolute fiasco, because the legislation simply does not do what it purports to do, and is, again, entirely about ducking hard decisions. Fundamentally, you either need to, if you care, what the Bill of Rights is trying to address is theoretically the role of the European Convention of Human Rights on British law. Now, it actually doesn't change anything, because there are 2 answers if you have concerns about that. One is you withdraw from the convention, or 2 is that Parliament, as it currently has the right to do under the Human Rights Act, simply allows declarations of incompatibility. If the courts say this contravenes the Human Rights Act, Parliament can go, nonetheless, we, the Sovereign Parliament of the United Kingdom, back this policy. If you're not prepared to do either of those, there is no magical hair-splitting device that will get you out of this problem. So I think that the Tories, and this is why I'm so baffled by this decision by Rishi Sunak to bring Dominic Raab and this bill back, the Tories are going to spend a lot of time passing a very controversial bill that will achieve next to nothing. And then they'll own it, because they will no longer be able to say to those voters who are angry about these issues, this is about Labour's Human Rights Act. suddenly all of these things will be down to the Tories' Bill of Rights. So it's absolutely extraordinary, the lack of strategic thought, because you're right, what the Tories need is stuff to put on their leaflets. If you talk to Tory MPs, elected in 2019 on a relatively high spending manifesto, millions of voters who backed the Tories for the first time, they want something to show for it. Lost 2 years to the pandemic, lost 1 year to sort of general Johnsonian chaos. They have 2 years to give those voters a reason to vote Conservative again. And it's not obvious what Rishi Sunak's going to give Red Wall MPs specifically so they can go to those voters and say, look, I know it's been a tough few years, but we've delivered X, Y, and Z. Please back us again.
Well, on that thought, what do you think the next 2 years of a Sunak government will actually look like? Is he going to outline a new vision? So, for example, he's pitched himself as a safe pair of hands. And do you think that actually is an asset? Or does the perception that he lacks a wider vision beyond just balancing the books, will that prove an electoral liability, do you think?
Who's that to?
Any of you that want to come in on that?
I'll go in. I think Rishi Sunak is basically trying to do something impossible, which is unify the Conservative Party from a position of weakness. Ultimately, Tory MPs, they like strength and a sense of direction. And if you provide both of those things, they're not massively fussed all the time about what precise direction they're pulling in. There were lots of people who were sucking their teeth about, if Boris Johnson becomes leader of the Tory party, I don't know what I'll do. Some of them went and served in his government. Lots of the people who were very enthused about Boris Johnson's Red Wall strategy didn't like Theresa May when she was trying to do much the same thing, because she just wasn't doing it well. But unfortunately, Rishi has come in a historically weak position. He's inherited key members of his cabinet from his predecessor. He's jettisoning most of his relatively incoherent policy offer from the summer. And I think it's a shame, because some of those things that he talks about in July, some of the stuff like housing was mostly awful, but that's every Conservative candidate is bad on housing. You just have to price that in. But some of the stuff was relatively ambitious. He was talking about maybe comprehensively reforming the Home Office. Now, that's a really good policy, because it doesn't matter what side of the wall you're on, right? If you're a blue wall voter, it's a relatively good liberal measure to try and get the government working properly. It's the kind of thing you'd expect someone like Rishi to do. And if you're on the more authoritarian wing of the Conservative Party coalition, well, the Home Office is useless. It doesn't solve the boats. It doesn't get the planes to Rwanda. It doesn't bring down immigration. It doesn't do any of the things that you want it to do. So that could have been a win-win for both halves of the coalition. Unfortunately, he's jettisoned it. So it's very difficult to see. He's got so little political room because his party is so divided. He's got so little fiscal room because of the budget black hole he's going to have to fill. It's hard to see where Rishi Sunak gets a chance to make a positive impression on the electorate in the next 2 years.
I'm also worried that obviously he's meant to be the guy who's coming in to fix the economy. That's meant to be his kind of skill. But it sounds like from all the kind of smoke signals the Treasury is sending up that he's planning to raise taxes in some of the worst possible ways, doing things like raising the 45p rate to 50p. It gets you very little revenue and it's basically just confiscatory. Raising council tax without revaluating properties makes no sense. So, if he's going to have to raise taxes and fill this fiscal black hole, he could at least do it in a kind of fair and sensible way, but it doesn't even seem like he's doing that. So yeah, I'm a bit worried about that.
Yeah, and there is a tendency, and I think we've seen this with all Conservative leaders, for them to end up doing a bit of overcorrection from whoever came before. And there is, to me, the politics of introducing the 50p rate again, I can entirely understand, even if, as you say, for lots of reasons it's a bad idea. But it's that sense of we must constantly distinguish from what's come before, rather than kind of building on it. Because what's quite interesting about, and it's not often talked about the Truss administration, is on those areas that they weren't focused on, they were actually quite pragmatic, on things like, Channel 4 privatisation could work, or, the Bill of Rights is just not a priority at the moment. They were very keen to do that. I wonder, actually, if despite, Rishi's quite clear economic conditions, you're going to see that same kind of prioritisation going on. And then if it does happen, as you say, what is that prioritisation going to be? One of the things I've often debated, and I just don't know the answer to, is actually where Rishi is on lots of social policy issues or social issues. Like, lots of his outlook seems very kind of, he adopts that kind of Silicon Valley kind of mentality to sort of global Britain. But actually, if you look at his leadership stuff, a lot of stuff was quite socially conservative. And so I don't quite know how he gets that. And And actually, if he starts doing the socially conservative stuff, those established, we call them established liberals, at more in common, sort of blue wall voters who've moved back to him, so they go, oh, we're not sure. But he doesn't win back the red wall voters either, and you end up in the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, the best case for Rishi is that his sort of vibe reassures Liberal voters, and then he manages to actually deliver for red wall Tory voters. And the worst case is that his policies alienate the Liberals, while his vibe alienates the red wall. I think the biggest problem for Rishi actually is that the realignment, I think, is going to happen. I think Liz Truss represented a kickback against that idea. For all that she talked about being the red wall candidate, she was not really the red wall candidate. She was the candidate for traditional post-Thatcherian liberal economic conservatism, and I don't think that that's really going to win. I think that the future, whether it takes the Tory party 5 years or 10 years or 20 years to get there, is going to be a red wall flavoured Tory party. Now, I don't think Rishi Sunak is fundamentally in sympathy with the kind of conservatism that will deliver the red wall in the long term, because fundamentally, what does that entail? It means, one, being more comfortable about public spending. I think fundamentally he's a former chancellor, and you can tell he's a former chancellor because they all have treasury brain to a certain extent. But specifically, it's things like capital investment in the north. Now, it looks as if, and I hope, as Alys says, the noises coming out of the Treasury are absolutely horrifying, and I really hope that some of them are expectations management. But one of the things that does seem to be on the table for real is that because cutting entitlements is so hard, because cutting pensions or welfare is so difficult, the thing that always gets raided is for capital expenditure and investment. So that means things like Northern Powerhouse Rail, projects that would actually deliver growth over the long term, that would deliver returns, and crucially in this case, would enable the northern parts of the country to compete on a fairer economic footing with the south. Now, I think a proper red wall conservative government would be absolutely putting that as almost priority one after servicing the needs of the old, right? It would be making sure Rishi was there, hammering spikes into new railway lines, waving through the new coal mine that they want to dig for the steel industry up there, all of that kind of stuff. And it would be establishing the Tories as builders of things and as investors in the north of England. I simply just don't think Rishi's instincts are in the right place, so that when he's having those really hard discussions with Jeremy Hunt, and when the Treasury is coming after every penny it can get, I think he's going to give away crucial capital expenditure projects, which is going to set the Tories back in chunks of the north for potentially another generation.
I think the one area where I potentially, and whether he's bold enough to do it, I don't know, where I think you could start to get at entitlements is around a more contributory element to things like benefits. Because what's really interesting is when, we've spent quite a lot of time looking at the debate about benefits rising with inflations or earnings, and actually the median voter actually says earnings rather than inflation. But actually, when you dig into why in focus groups, it's because, well, actually, I want working people who've been paid in to be supported. And I actually think it could be a really popular policy across the red and blue wall. It is what I actually think one of those unifies, but particularly the red wall, to reintroduce some kind of contributory element to benefits. Whether, there's the political boldness to do that, I do not know.
I mean, I think the problem with a lot of contributory stuff is that basically we don't have I think the argument I've seen is that you need something like ID cards to make a lot of this stuff much easier to do. And the Tories have a kind of reflex libertarian, even though, you still need ID to function in British society. It's always just a bill or a passport. But the Tories have this kind of residual libertarian resistance to ID cards, which makes a lot of these proposals that would be quite popular hard to do. Another one is, there's a story today about Labour MPs attacking Rishi Sunak because he refuses to say, or his spokesperson refuses to say, whether or not he has private health insurance. Now, bluntly, one of the reasons that the UK consistently spends a lot less on healthcare than European countries is because we have a healthcare system which, because it's so fiercely exclusively private, publicly funded, it shuts out additional revenue streams, and it shuts out private investment. And now we have that line is breaking down a little bit. There are some NHS trusts that offer private healthcare, but frankly, if you think about the cost to the state of treating someone on the NHS, if you think about the cost to the state of somebody's health condition getting worse because they're stuck in a queue for 6 months or more to get essential care, would it be possible? It might be quite tricky, but if the government were to restore what New Labour abolished, which was making private health insurance tax deductible and extending that from the over 60s to all working age people, there'd be some small cost to the state, you know, in the tax you would have paid on however much money you spend on your Vitality subscription or whatever. But theoretically, by shifting those patients out into the private system, taking them off the NHS's books, getting them treated faster, that would save money. And that would be a shift towards a contributory system for healthcare, but only for people who chose to do it and who could afford to do it. Now, it's not going to change the world overnight, but it's the kind of small policy that you could theoretically do that would push people in the right direction. But again, my worry is if you're thinking like the Treasury, all you see is, oh, well, we'd lose a couple of hundred a year per however many thousand voters did this because from the actual deduction. And so they won't do it. So there's lots of ways in which you can see a way towards a better system. But for some reason in the United Kingdom, it seems to prove incredibly difficult to get there.
Well, as we're coming up towards the end of our time, the final question I'd like to put to all the panelists is this. With nearly all the opinion polls predicting that Labour would secure a comfortable majority in the next election, what does the Conservative Party have to do to maximise its chances of winning the next general election? And if you could pick just one thing and summarise in one sentence, that would be great. Alys, I'll start with you, followed by Luke, then Henry.
It's quite difficult in one sentence. I feel like it's kind of Labour's to lose at this point. And I feel like the one advantage that the Conservatives have is that Labour is still not able to tell people what it stands for, merely what it stands against. And I think it's still engaging in quite off-putting kind of class war politics. I feel like things like VAT on private school fees actually won't play as well as they might think. And so I feel like the Conservatives have to kind of get through the next 2 years and hope that Keir Starmer doesn't get much better.
Luke?
Yeah, I mean, again, hard to do in a sentence, but definitely agree with Alys on. I don't quite think, again, from our focus groups, Labour hasn't quite sealed the deal. I mean, they're certainly ahead and people would vote no, but there are hesitations over the party and over Keir, actually, who consistently doesn't test that well. But I think it is there to lose. And I think the only way that the Conservatives can set themselves up to turn it around is a focus on delivering things. Decide what those one or two things are. Probably give it to Michael Gove to be in charge of delivering them, because he'll actually do it, and then go out and get it done. So you've got something to say, as Henry said, in the Red Wall, to say, look, you've got this as a result of putting your faith in the Conservatives. That's why you should keep on doing it. And at the same time, I think avoid some of the unnecessary fights. That's not to say I'm not one of these people who says, anything on social policy, culture war. Immigration is really important. They've got to sort out small boats somehow. But don't get dragged into fights where you're not actually then going to follow through, because that just pisses people off even more and is ultimately worse.
Henry?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Luke on the importance of delivery. I think that all I would say to expand it is that the government should not be afraid to selectively make machinery of government changes that will help delivery. So I think, for example, the fact that Rishi Sunak's team have talked about, they've jettisoned the stuff about reforming the Home Office and all the rest of it, that's not a nice to have. That is actually crucial to getting any good results out of the Home Office, and it will signal to voters that you're taking those issues seriously. So yes, find an enumerated list of deliverables, absolutely zero focus on delivering them, but also, focus in on delivering them, but also make sure that you attend to the machinery of government as well. The one thing you shouldn't be doing is picking big, complex, controversial legislative fights, because you do not have time.
Well, with that, and on that note, we will end it there. Thank you so much for everyone at home who's been watching, and thank you very much to our panelists, Luke, Henry, and Alys, for joining us and for giving up your time. It's been fascinating to listen to your opinions and insights on what the future of conservatism holds. So thank you once again for joining us, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.